Welcome everyone to this webinar on resilience and reinvention, and particularly a warm welcome to our guests, Emma Alberici, Michael West and Matthew Ricketson, the co-editor of the book Upheaval. But alas, tonight we can't welcome Amanda Mead because she's still suffering the ill effects of COVID and is unable to join us, so we wish her a speedy recovery. So it's all about resilience and reinvention. These are issues, of course, that have a personal and an industry-wide dimension. And I want to start with the personal. And by doing that, I'd like to ask Emma, firstly, having been through a pretty brutal departure from the ABC, have you survived? How are you?
Here I am. Exhibit A. I'm fine, thank you for asking. The last couple of years have been eventful and not entirely satisfying, but where I am now is a good place, and I can vouch for the fact that there is life after journalism, even if you don't ever really leave journalism.
Yeah, look, I think there's so much in that short answer that we can unpack, and which we will in a moment. Michael, let me ask you the same question, because you struck it out alone in about July 2016, I think, thereabouts, after a reasonably brutal departure from the Sydney Morning Herald. How are you and how are you going?
Going very well. I'm still surviving as a small businessman, Andrew, so it's really a privilege to work for the community, which we do. I'm just funded by, people that want to support me and the people that work with me, obviously. And everything's going well. Going across a few platforms, even joined up with TikTok, and it's all going pretty well.
Great. So again, some issues there we'll come back to. Matthew, we've found in our research for Upheaval all sorts of issues that people have had to deal with in leaving media organisations. And in many cases, the departure from the media has been a really harrowing process for people to go through, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, excuse me, sorry. It was one of the things that struck us that even people who were nearing retirement age, say, and they were happy to leave, your kind of so-called stress-free, trouble-free kind of departure. Even those people who we interviewed they still found it a wrench to leave. Not only a job, but a vocation that most of the people we interviewed were, very strongly, I personally and professionally identified with the vocation of being a journalist in a media organisation. So even those people found it a wrench, and others found it a bigger wrench. And in some cases, we found some people who were just really happy to get out of there. They weren't enjoying working in newsrooms anymore, and they were only too happy to get out. But they were the minority.
Yes, that was, I think, a really interesting finding in the research that we did, where we interviewed lots of people in depth, but also did wide surveying of people who'd left the industry, that both those who left voluntarily and those who were forced out shared that sense of loss of identity and faced difficulties reinventing themselves in other guises.
Yeah, and obviously Emma and Michael have views on this as well, but I mean, journalism is a very kind of immersive profession. You're kind of in it or you're not. And, you don't have a lot of time to think about anything much other than the story of the moment, the story of the day or the week or whatever you're working on. And so to kind of suddenly not be in that environment does take some adjusting. I mean, one of the people we interviewed, this is just a kind of quite mundane example, but it was quite an interesting anecdote from Gillian Lord, who'd been at the Canberra Times for many years as the features editor. And when the day after her redundancy took effect, she got up the next morning, walked down the front driveway to pick up the newspaper. It wasn't there. And that's because, in those days, the company, many newspaper companies would do this, would provide employees with the paper every day in the hope that they would have read it before they came to work, which most of them did. And that habit, inculcated over many years was suddenly shattered like that because no paper on the front driveway.
Yeah. Emma, was your departure from the ABC in the end voluntary or involuntary?
It was a mix of both, and quite public. So I think people kind of vaguely understand what went down. But it was in the very end, a bit of both, because I learned a lot about redundancy, actually, about what it actually means. I mean, to be redundant in the very strictest legal sense means they have to prove that you have no utility in the organisation. And considering I had done every single role in the organisation and was at the time working for the Foreign Correspondent Program and doing stories on the early lockdowns around the world, and doing that in an innovative way without being able to travel and so on. The idea that I had no utility at the ABC was not only shocking and insulting, but, you know, patently untrue. And so it was a horrible time that did play out more publicly than I wished it to. And really, I described it to friends as, you know, journalism for me was my first love. It was something I did as a passion, not because I wanted any accolades or because I wanted anything financial out of it. I mean, I left Channel 9 when it was absolutely not de rigueur to do such a thing, to go to public broadcasting in 2001. I was sort of at the apex of my time at 9, and they were wanting me to do other things, and I wanted to go to public broadcasting because I believed in the story rather than anything else. And so that was financially limiting, if you like, making that decision when I did. And it went to the fact that, and you alluded to this, both you and Andrew, Matthew and Andrew, that this is something we do as journalists, not because of anything other than, I mean, it's a very odd career because we do, it consumes our lives, right? And so that loss of identity, of course, and when you do it as publicly as I did, I mean, I was a journalist, I wasn't a TV presenter. I considered myself a storyteller, and, you know, news and investigation coursed through my blood for a long time. And so leaving and, you know, compounded, you know, the attacks on my credibility sort of compounded that whole departure and created another sort of dilemma, because how do you leave one career and go into another when you have all these questions around what an idiot you are and you don't know anything about economics, even though you've done business reporting for, you know, 25 years and so on. I mean, it was a horrible time.
Yeah, so there was lawyers at 10 paces at one point, and you are having to deal with this attack on your credibility. So you're fighting on all sorts of fronts, aren't you? You're fighting on a very personal level. Your reputation has been traduced, and you're thinking also about your future. You're letting go of the past and embracing a new way of life. It's an extremely difficult time.
Yeah, and look, when you're doing it in broadcasting, it's just much more visible than if you're doing it in newspapers, you know, and it's it was just unfortunate that my profile was as high as it was. And so, you know, it was also unfortunate that my photo was on sort of the Australian Online before I almost before I even knew that I was targeted for redundancy. So, you know, read into that what you will. It was a pretty bruising time.
Yeah. Michael, I know your story of how you ended up leaving the Sydney Morning Herald, and it also has elements of this, doesn't it? This sense of betrayal and that you knew you could do the job and that you were of value to the company, but the company had at times stories about what it wanted you to do and be that didn't really match your reality.
Well, I mean, I was just basically sacked. They tried to do it on the quiet, tried to say that, here, take a redundancy. You can pretend that it's a voluntary redundancy like everybody else. It was probably the voluntary redundancy round number 5 since I was there from 2008 to 2016, 8 years. And I just said, no, I'm not going to go. But I basically there were a lot of complaints by vested interests, by corporates and people in power, and that just got to them in the end. They didn't want to back me anymore. They didn't want to argue the toss either, because I would stand up to them and argue for the story and put a set of accounts in front of them and their eyes would glaze over, and they wouldn't be able to respond to my defence because a lot of it was finance stuff. But they just got sick of taking complaints in the end. So basically I felt as though I was pushed out for the crime of journalism. But it's been good, I think. I've managed to make it work somehow on the other side. So I'm not sure that it's for everybody, because small business, what Matthew was saying before about the rigours of journalism anyway. I mean, I had 6 defamation threats last year. It was my pinnacle year for defamation threats, for pettifogging. And we saw them all off. Well, they never quite leave you. I mean, they hang around. They never say, oh, sorry, we shouldn't have threatened you and we're going to go now. They just leave them hanging. But we've seen them off effectively. But those kind of things. And then HR, running just bills and running a business. And we got flooded in the floods, funnily enough, the other day. When Manly got flooded, the office got flooded. So we've been through quite a bit. I had COVID the other day as well. So, there's a few things going on.
So you've had pestilence and flood.
A lot.
And redundancy, you could probably add that to the list. So, Matthew, the range of experiences of walking out the door we found in our research were quite wide, weren't they?
Yeah, and maybe I should, if you like, channel my inner Amanda Mead here for a moment, because she went from working as the media reporter at The Australian, had been doing that for a number of years. Almost everyone in the media industry knows Amanda. So she's very high profile within the industry. She left because she was no longer, well, this is what she told us, she was no longer enjoying working at The Australian and at News, and she took a package, and she pretty soon after that started working for Guardian Australia. And the thing I think is really interesting here is that most people, I would imagine, in the industry think, oh, she had a gig lined up, good on you, that's great. But in fact, she didn't. She left because she was no longer enjoying it at work as much as she had done at The Australian. But she actually told us she didn't have a plan for what to do next. She wanted to spend a lot more time with her kids, and she did that. She watched a lot of afternoon television for a while, and then she just started to kind of send in story ideas and suggestions to people at Guardian Australia. And also they started ringing her and saying, this particular thing's happening, this little micro media scandal's happening. What do you know about it? Can you do a fast piece for us? And so on. And so she started doing that, and gradually she kind of parlayed that into what's a version of what she used to be doing, which is now a weekly column called The Weekly Beast, and breaking media news stories as they come up. But I just think the interesting thing there is the transition is not as seamless as it looked, and she actually took quite a risk because she's she's not sort of 65 and ready to stop working. She was, a mother with youngish children, still right in the middle of the kind of the meat of her career. So I think that's a useful kind of, I hope I haven't misrepresented her in any way, but I think not.
Yeah, I think that risk-taking element is true of almost anyone who leaves. Michael, I know that you took risks, but Emma, I wonder whether you did. When you left, you, unlike Michael and Amanda, made the decision at some point to not go back into the media. I don't know why you made that decision or whether it was made for you, but was there risk-taking in what you did next?
Look, a lot of what I did next, I had no choice in. I mean, look, we all have choices, so that's a bit of a cop-out. I'm a single mum, with 3 children at school, and, I didn't have the luxury of kind of sitting around and wondering what next. I had a decent payout, but also, huge mortgage and all that sort of stuff. So really, I was so... and it's worth talking about mental health because I'd never had any mental ill health in my life. I always considered myself to be one of the most optimistic and positive and happy people, really, and nothing really got me down much. And I suddenly, within the space of a month of being told I was being made redundant, I lost something like 7 kilos and I became skeletal and I was anxious ridden. And because I didn't see my life, I didn't see this coming, and it was absolutely designed to blindside me. And so because the ABC had been having conversations with me about doing other things, so you know, it was shocking to me on so many levels, and then affected my health pretty badly. And the fact that my credibility had continued to be traduced throughout that period, I couldn't see a way to stay in journalism because I would be a liability potentially for any employer, because the public is thinking, I don't really know what I'm talking about, notwithstanding the 30 years that happened before the 2018 debacle. And so when Auto and General in Queensland came to me, big multinational firm, and said, we need, you know, a chief of communications and government relations and strategy and so on, I took the call. and that's basically what happened. I was really lucky that I got offered a really interesting and completely different thing to do, and given a lot of latitude in that to learn corporate Australia. I think when you report business, you do think that there's a chance you might get into business in some way, shape or form. Not that many do, but I think it's always in the back of your mind that you could. And in my case, I never thought I would, because I just love telling stories in the field and thought I would do that for a long time to come. But anyway, so I did that for about 8 months. And
by the way, doing that, did that help with your mental health to have that?
Oh, absolutely, because I felt like I had a purpose again, right? Because you go through this whole, and I can't say it enough that it was sort of the love of my life, right? The work as a journalist, you don't kind of work and then go home, and you know it's always there. And when you're doing the sort of stuff I was doing, the long form TV and so on, there's not enough hours in the day, so really it can occupy every waking moment. And so to have that cut out of your life, it's like, oh yeah, I love my kids and you know, but hold on, where is all that other part of my life gone? So to be thrown into a really big executive leadership position in a weighty company was exactly what I needed, because I'm a pacey sort of person and I need to be occupied. So that was great. But they're based in Brisbane, and so the time it would have taken to open the office in Sydney and so on with small kids, the up and back was really too hard. And so now I'm doing executive search, which is brilliant because I'm doing it in the sort of media, digital technology and professional services space that I'm really comfortable in. And so I feel like I'm melding my skills that I've acquired over the last, you know, more than 30 years. And it's terrific, actually. Do I miss journalism, if that's what you were going to ask me? Absolutely.
I don't think I need to ask that, because I think and in your case, Michael, you had calls from people and offers of work, but you decided to not go to the comfort of a big company, if I can describe it that way, but to go it alone in a very precarious kind of way on your own. So you embraced other risks and challenges, and perhaps didn't have that comfort that Emma experienced of being embraced by an organisation that took you into its fold.
Well, I just wanted to continue doing what I was doing, being a journalist. I didn't quite realise what I was getting myself in for. And obviously, I've got a big risk appetite because it's not an easy path. And, you know, on the defamation front, as I was saying before, you know, I haven't got the comfort of a large corporation's balance sheet behind me or anything like that. But I just wanted to continue being a journalist, and lots of thrills and spills, but it's sort of worked out. Now I feel I get a bit of support on social media, and I feel an obligation to people now. And I think the mainstream media is failing pretty badly. too close to government and running too many agendas and too close to the big corporations which fund them. And that comes through. I'm not saying all journalists are bad in the mainstream by any stretch, but I think the management is generally poor. And that is paradoxically, that's a huge leg up for me because, of course, the worse they do, including ABC, etc., the more scope there is. When you haven't got any, it's actually a real privilege, Andrew, when you haven't got anybody behind you expecting stuff like a large company or government advertising income or government pressure like the SBS and ABC get, it's very refreshing. You can basically have a real crack, whether you're wrong or right or halfway in between. You can have a red hot go, and that is a huge privilege. It means that you're not bound by the same things as many of your sort of peers in the mainstream. And I think I benefited in 6 years, going the seventh year from the problems as the mainstream media has become more concentrated and closer to government, and the information's been funneled through straight from the PMO, often into the mainstream, then followed up in the 24-hour news cycle. It's become so homogenous, so biased in many cases that to be able to have a real crack is a privilege.
At what point, or did it come at some point where you found the experience, your completely different interaction that you're having with audiences? At what point did that sort of kick in and become restorative for you and your mental health? At what point did that become energizing all in itself, so that it drove you to want to go on in the choice you'd made to go it alone?
Well, we discussed this at length in the Marathon National Archives interview, Andrew, and at the time when they sort of shifted me out of the mainstream, I did get some other offers from people, but of course the business model had collapsed for the mainstream, and that was a dire thing. I think it's bouncing back now to a point because of the very problems, the very conflicts, which I was talking about before with its funding model now and paywalls. But the money sort of on offer from these was just half of what I was on. And it wasn't a money thing really anyway. I just thought I'd have a crack and do it myself. And it sort of worked out all right.
Yeah. Matthew, have you got a comment on this? The way people sort of get recharged from what they're doing after these jobs in journalism?
Yeah. Well, I think two quite contrasting stories there in that sense from Michael and Emma. There are a range of experiences in the sense that some people, I'll give you one example, Louise Graham, who was originally a photographer and then became a pictures editor for both the major media companies, and eventually she left. She took a package and she set up, she in a sense became a kind of, a beneficiary of the collapsing business model that Michael was just referring to, so that she in a sense set up an organisation called the Media Gang, which included a number of her former colleagues primarily from The Age. And as the Age, then part of the then Fairfax Media, was sort of downsizing and sloughing off various parts of its operation, the people at Media Gang, who previously had been in the room, in the office with other people, would take on some of that work, do it in a sense in pieces, as in a piecemeal fashion, and it was. I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure it would be less expensive than it had been, which is kind of one of the stories of the internet, isn't it? The sort of atomization of almost everything, so as to make everything as cheap as possible in terms of providing the service, and that was one of the things she did. But she also, and I did the interview with her for the National Library, and she told me how one of the other things she did, and this goes to the kind of, if you like, if not restorative, then the kind of feeding your soul side of things, which is she would do a lot of work both mentoring younger people, not just in journalism and the media, but in other areas, to, as an experienced senior female kind of both professional and executive. She wanted to do that. And she also wanted to work in aged care homes, visiting people and providing support there. And both of those things she wanted to, emphasise to me in the interview were really important to her. In some ways, gradually became more important to her than the media gang work, which in a sense was a kind of slightly smaller version of what she had already been doing for many years.
Yeah. Emma, in your role in corporate search, you must be talking now, I guess, to other journalists who've left the industry and having these kinds of conversations, which would put you right back where you were when you left, I guess, going through that, huge range of emotions that you go through after leaving the industry. And you're meeting people probably who really at heart still want to be journalists, but are having to look at other careers. Are you finding that the skills they have translate? And I have to say that a question has just come in the Q&A, which is almost exactly that question about what skills people bring with them from the industry into new walks of life.
It's extraordinary, actually. I would get at least 2, if not more, phone calls, and I make a habit of having a coffee with them. Some of them are coming to me from overseas, who are Australians living overseas wanting to come home, who've been journalists overseas, and the skill set is extraordinarily transferable. And I'm very buoyed by the fact that people are coming to me and having these conversations, because I wish someone had had the conversation with me, actually, because whilst I thought maybe I might leave journalism at some point, I never really thought I would. Because, you think there's only so much of this torture you can take, and then you just keep doing it to yourself, some sort of weird self-inflicting harms. So the skill set that is replicable is obviously every business. I say to people, and I'm having this conversation a lot because my practice is also in digital. One of the things I say to companies is, just because you can publish doesn't mean you should, right? Because everyone with a website, I say, is a media company, right? Mm. And I know that Scott Farquhar from Atlassian once said to me on Lateline that every company, and that was, I think, 2014 or 2015, I never forget, he said to me, every company is now a software company, because one way or another they have to provide some sort of bespoke technological solution that gives their customers and stakeholders an idea of what they do and so on, and actually implement what they do in a SaaS way. So the replicable skills are about storytelling, right? Every company has to tell their story. They have to tell it on their website or tell it when they're out in the field in a sales capacity. They have to tell it to the community when they engage with, politicians or with regulators or so on. And that skill, also the analysis skill and the research skills about, when you're in a financial services firm and you need to get to the nub of investments and so on. There are a lot of journalists swimming around as analysts these days as well. And research, everything. We have a team of researchers here that work in executive search, right? So there are researchers everywhere in all sorts of organisations where journalistic skill sets are absolutely valuable. And the other thing about journalists is that we work at pace and we can get to the nub of things quickly. And not everybody can do that, but we've obviously trained to be able to sort of, cut the wheat from the chaff, or, move aside the bullshit, if you like. And so we can get to the point fast, and presentation, presenting ideas. There are so many things that we assume other people can do until we're actually in a workplace with disparate skills and realise that the sorts of things, and writing, I'm here to tell you, not everyone can write. And so, and it's a skill that is required everywhere. Again, doubling back to what I started with, everybody with a website is kind of a media company, but not a lot of them should be. Let me just put it that way.
Michael, I'm wondering as you're listening to this, because for you, corporates and them telling their stories, I know that you have the view that a lot of corporate storytelling actually happens in our mainstream media, and that those mainstream media outlets aren't very good at working out the difference between a press release and a bit of independent journalism, and hence the need for what you do. So I wonder how you respond to what Emma's just said there.
Well, yeah, I agree on the skill sets. I mean, I'm not in another area, but effectively it is a bit different doing what I'm doing to what I was doing before, just gathering news and writing it. It is probably a useful skill to have. I never forget Danny John, who was, when I was business editor of the Herald, he was the banking reporter. This bloke was prolific. He used to bash out 4 stories a day, and then he went to Westpac PR, and they paid him more money, as they do, big bank PR, and he was so bored because he'd have to get 10 people to sign off on a press release, which took him 70 seconds to write because he was so quick. And so he was frustrated, and eventually, I don't know whether he's still there, but the sort of money that he would have been paid, probably over $500,000 as a PR, maybe $1 million for a bank like that when he got to head the thing. And they've got armies of PRs, all these large companies. So, when I started in journalism, as we said before, Andrew, there was 10 journalists for every 1 PR. You used to ring up and go straight through to the head of Woolworths. But, of course, it's exactly the other way around, if not 100 PRs for every 1 journalist. So it's really changed a lot, the whole thing, and it continues to change. And I think, we were surprised when we looked at the business model disintegrating when I was at Fairfax, and Jack Matthews, who was the head of digital at that time, basically came up with the view that you can't squeeze the toothpaste back in the tube. In other words, once you've given stuff away for free, you can't charge for it. Well, they've done that, actually, and they put their paywalls up. But at the same time, they've taken so many redundancies, so much brain power and expertise and experience out of these places that they've debilitated the product, many of these companies, not all. I mean, The Guardian's been very successful, and it's gone with a no paywall model because I think of the incompetence of some of the other media. It's been able to it's been clear and focused in its strategy, and that's worked, and it's focused on good journalism and so on. They keep poaching my staff, so I won't praise them too highly, but 2 to The Guardian now. But, it is changing a lot, but I think we're at the early stages still of this sort of revolution in media, because where does it go from here? Because at the moment, you've got all the stuff being funneled through from the people that control the information, which is the government, into just a little Canberra bubble of just a few large institutions. If you're in that little gravy train, if you're on the drip, what are you going to do? Say, no, I don't want that story. And if you write it too straight or critically, and you're not writing it with information because the policy doesn't come out till the next day, if ever. These days it's got ridiculous now, where during the election campaign they're just making announcements that are plainly ridiculous, that they know the media allies won't even bother to check or follow up on. They don't care. It's all about announcements, image over substance. But I think it's changing the whole thing. And I thought, where does it go from here when you've got these paywall places now that depend on this funneled information for their validity, and government subsidies? They're all subsidised by government, either directly and through Google News Showcase, the protection racket, which is Google News Showcase. And so they're compromised, all of them, which is great for me personally because I don't have those. I don't have to worry about all that. But where does it go? Can they keep controlling this information? I mean, is it going to end up like Pravda, where you just say nice things every day and that's it? We've got to the point where they're bayoneting the dead when there's a story, like a Christian Porter story or something like that. They all pile in, and the Labor's Mean Girls story. Their independent media is growing because there's a distrust, and it's palpable on social media, of the mainstream. And so I don't know where it goes, because their influence depends on the feed from government because they're behind paywalls.
Yeah. Look, I think this idea of bayoneting the dead, which is just such a powerful analogy. I've been thinking about that idea with the whole gotcha story this week. It's just, day 3 or 4.
Which one?
Yeah, which one? Is it ever going to end? Matthew, we're kind of into this idea of reinvention, the fact that we've seen lots of stories coming out of the research of people reinventing themselves post-redundancy, and some pretty interesting examples of people doing that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, there are a number. One of them would be Veronica Ridge, who used to work at the Age for many years, but began at the old Herald and Weekly Times, but spent a lot of her career at the Age. She took a package, like a lot of people, and her two sons were digital natives, so they were interested in software, and they were trying to get up some kind of digital site, not a news site, just a kind of entertainment lifestyle site. They weren't getting anywhere. What she did was add her storytelling skills, the sort of skills that Emma was talking about earlier on, and they were amazed. They said, "Oh my goodness, you've got all sorts of hits on here which we've never had." And she didn't know the kind of tech side of it, the digital side of it so well, but she did know the storytelling side. This tells you how many years ago it was, but she kind of, with her nose for a story, noticed that at that time, this is about 8-9 years ago, the whole Twilight series of novels and films were big, and they kind of did a piece of what some people would call clickbait, but, some kind of stories about that connected with the audience, and off they went. So it's still, she refers to the site Isimo as a kind of cockroach startup, by which I think she means it can't be killed. It doesn't mean it's becoming vast and expansive. It just means it can't be killed, and they are continuing on with it. But that's a kind of someone taking it there, if you like, their traditional skills from journalism with, this case, their kids who had kind of digital native skills, and putting the two together and making at least some kind of new business out of it. Not of the kind that Michael's been doing, which is at the hard end of investigative work, obviously really important, but another part of the overall media ecosystem.
Yeah, because there is also research that shows that journalists who come out of legacy media positions generally aren't really embracing entrepreneurial approaches to new journalism. And I know, Michael, you're a bit of an exception to that rule, and that globally, I've done studies with journalists who've done this, and they go down a very precarious path, and they suffer accordingly financially as a result, but they are committed to what they're doing, reinventing some form of journalism as they once did it. Are you finding that with people that come to you, Emma, that they are really keen to go out alone, or they want to get into a large corporation or an organisation because they don't have that entrepreneurial bent?
I actually had, let me just sort of turn the question around a bit. I had a lot of people wanting me to go on my own and to do a podcast, do a newsletter, do this, do that. And I entertained the idea for about 1 minute, because having written 3 books on entrepreneurialism and starting your own business and so on, I knew exactly. And I came from a family that my dad had his own business. I knew how hard it was. And, with 3 small children at school, there's just no way I was going to, compound the stresses in my life with running my own show. And, in the very brutal realities, I would have had to have, when you get paid a big salary, you have big mortgages and big expenses, right? So that would have meant selling houses and doing all that sort of stuff. And I just didn't have it in me, also because I was a bit sick from what had happened. So other people, I know a lot of people right now who'd like to do their own thing, but it's not easy. And further to what Michael was talking about with the whole Google and Facebook tie-up with the government and the ACCC in terms of channeling money into the media organisations, there is no obvious funding formula anymore for news, right? So you're really at the whim. And, kudos to Michael that he's got so many subscribers that he can support himself and others. It's not easy, right, going that model. There has to be another model, and I'm not sure what that will be. But, the ABC is absolutely captured by the government and has been for pretty much the last 9 years, funnily enough. And I was there for 18 years, and the last, sort of 7 to 9 have been really obviously different. And the ABC has become quite timid in the face of the relentless attacks from government. Not to say that Labor was any happier with the way things were going, but it just didn't seem the organisation reacted quite the way it has in more recent years. And I think that, Michael and I have both done business journalism, and that's the hardest to do, really. I think almost harder than political journalism, because there are those very weighty vested interests who have dollars behind them. When I was at Nine as a sort of quasi-business reporter at the end there, I was covering the OneTel trials, and my boss was James Packer, and he was also in the stand. And so I was, getting a lot of heat over what some of the people were saying about him. And, the fact of the matter is the media organisations in a country are often going to be heavy in leadership with some of the most powerful people in the country. And so how do you marry the need to be, assiduous and diligent in business reporting with the fact that the bosses of this enormous enterprise are paying your salary? It's really, really hard. And I found that, especially obviously, no surprises, towards the last few years of my career at the ABC, when you're trying to analyse government policy, see, that's what we're lacking in this country. We've got so many political reporters, but we haven't got people really looking at the economic policy. What's behind it? How is it substantiated, not just from a dollars and cents, but how does it make sense in terms of, the whole fiscal overlay and tax and so on. I was looking at all the coverage today and going, where is the lens over the NBN? And I looked at because this was another, hobby horse of mine over my time at the ABC, and I was just astounded that Labor did such a horrid job of selling what should have been their, absolute key plank of the last election. And we've now fallen to 61st in the world in terms of internet speeds, behind Namibia and others. And nobody's looking at it and going, well, hold on, it's going to cost $60 billion and it's a half-baked, multi-something or other. We haven't got fibre to the premises, which is world's best practice, which we could have had we done things differently. And nobody, I want to see those stories, and I want to look at the numbers, and I want to look into what is Labor actually saying they're going to do. Are they going to go back to fibre? Why is no one asking the questions that we should be asking if we're looking at politics in a way that tells you more than someone's done a gaffe? And, it drives me mental.
Yeah,
anyway,
you're not the only one. But I think, Michael, you have to get a right of reply to that, because you are living this complexity and difficulty, and you've found a way to do it. But as we've said many times this evening, you're doing it in a precarious way where you've got to fight to get this model that you want to do it through to work.
Yeah, you've got to be prepared to be the. Well, I realised when I was a columnist, in fact, on The Australian, when it was slightly better than it is today, back in the day, and I realised that you really, in journalism, you had to be either a brand or a commodity, and I didn't want to. I always, as Emma was saying, I always liked to put the story first. Didn't want to interpose myself, hate using the first-person singular pronoun in a sentence, that sort of thing, but in the end, and now I'm on TikTok and YouTube and you name it, and it was interesting last year, might have been the year before, when Facebook did its news ban in response to the government's efforts to regulate them. And suddenly we were getting our most traffic. We were getting about 100,000 a month traffic from Facebook. And we looked at it. We got a bit more than that, actually. We looked at it and went, well, that's gone. What are we going to do? I mean, a bit of it came back, but so we immediately ramped up YouTube. I found a great guy on YouTube, and we took that from 3,000 or something, done nothing, and never used to do it much, to 60. That's about 60,000 now. So it can be done. I mean, Jordan Shanks is a classic example at the Friendly Geordies. You know, he's now 630,000 subs. Now that's twice the Fin Review and Australians. There's a bit of guesswork here, but if you're generous and say that they're 300,000 subs combined, and he's 620, and that's where his message is going to a lot of people. He's getting 100,000 a video. I'm getting about 20. You got John Cardogan at Auto Expert, and some of you guys might not be car people. I'm certainly not a car person, but he's a heck of a reporter, this bloke. And we were laughing the other day. I did a joint video thing with him, and he said, you know, it's such a great thing, and it's such an irony to be to be successful on your own, doing what other journalists can't do freely, is just tell the truth. Because you can tell the truth in the mainstream media, but if it's too much of the truth and people don't like it, they'll come after you. So you're risking your job. You've got a mortgage, that's no good. And if you're risk averse. So there's a lot of pressures that we don't have. There's a lot of pressures we do. Being on your own, you've got, you know, the defo and so on. But the model is changing. When you've got this bloke, Friendly Geordies, doing twice the subscription of the Australian and the Fin Review, the two national newspapers back, which have all the PR and marketing resources at their disposal. What is going on? How does this actually happen? It happens because there's a massive failure in the mainstream. And as Cardogan says, like, you know, and cars are an extreme. We've all worked in newsrooms with the car reporter, and they all drive around in a flash car, a new car every week, and it's hard. And if they've got something critical to say about the car, they bury that in the 15th paragraph. And he just comes out and just straight between the eyes with every company, no favourites, says exactly what he feels, because his business model isn't based on advertising, or it isn't based on government revenue and worrying about upsetting the government. So there is a model there. Now, where it's going from here, I'm not sure, but you know, nobody's doing it in the law yet, YouTube, properly. David McBride, I believe, is thinking about doing it. But, you know, there are opportunities there.
So what you're talking about there is harnessing the storytelling skills that Emma talked about before, that something that journalists have in spades, and adopting and using it in niche markets where there is not that truth-telling element out there, and where there's capacity for somebody to move in and tell it as it hasn't been told.
Well, that's right. You can't, because you're constrained somewhat by your resource base, because you can't do everything. You're running a business, and I'm a single father too, and I've got all this sort of stuff going on. So you can't do everything on your own. So you have to focus it. But that's the way the media is going anyway. In the old days, if you were into golf, say, you'd read, you know, the golf column in the Sydney Morning Herald. You know, but there's nothing like that really anymore. You go to a golf website or the TV, but you know, it's all broken down. And in the major rounds, in the business reporting, you used to have a retail reporter, two bank reporters, two resources reporters, one in manufacturing, one in media, one in all the different sectors. Now that doesn't really exist that much anymore. They've aggregated it, consolidated it. So where does it go? Yes, it breaks down into separate stuff. And my particular focus, although I get great stories offered to me sometimes in other sectors like health and so on, but really I'm focused on the power of corporations over democracy. And that focus is an important one, and people realise it's important. But yeah, you have to have focus, because you can't do it all. You can't just rabbit on about anything unless you're an incredible storyteller and people just want to read your purple prose simply because you write so beautifully or you present so well on the YouTube or something. But you have to. It is about storytelling, but it's also about a few other things.
And can I just say, the big organisations the big media organisations are constrained by time. So time is the biggest enemy of newsrooms now, and for you too, Michael, I'm sure, because to do a proper investigation, it requires time, and so no one's paying you while you're sitting there. In the case of, and I need to call out that Michael had been doing a lot of work on which companies hadn't been paying tax. I didn't actually know that until I got right into it, and then someone alerted me to the fact that Michael had done similar work. But, you know, that whole thing I did in 2018 to actually aggregate the 4 years worth of data we then had to see whether there was some pattern to who wasn't paying over, you know, successive years, that took me like on my own in the newsroom nearly 3 months of putting all the spreadsheets together from all the different years and working out sectors and was there a pattern for sectors, and, you know, and me on my salary, one of the highest paid people at the ABC, sitting at my desk, you know, looking at these, you know, Excel spreadsheets was, you know, not probably the best use of my time, but they don't have the, you know, there's that luxury doesn't exist anymore. You used to be able to do that because there wasn't any competition that was going to gazump you on other stories in the meantime, because it wasn't, you know, there wasn't so defrayed as it is now, the media. But who's going to fund that? You know, that's the problem. Who's going to fund people sitting around doing those sorts of investigations? It's not happening. You don't see it happen much in the newspapers. Nine and Fairfax obviously can do it together now, but I'm not sure about how many of them they're actually getting out because of the desire to be first. That constant sort of driver in journalism means you want to beat Joe Blogs on Twitter and everybody else who's out there, and it sort of muddles the purpose of journalism, which should be to really throw a light in dark places and so on. And it's much harder, I think, because of this pressure of time and this sort of artificial idea that being first means, you know, kind of beating the crowds on social media. And I think that that's really the biggest scourge on the industry has been the effect of social media, and the fact, obviously, that the funding model has collapsed because there is no time to look deeply into the issues that matter and the policy that matters. You know, I'd love someone in this election campaign to really have a look at what's going on with the MBM, what's it really cost versus, reward, and what they're going to do with it, all that sort of stuff that always interested me so much, that sort of seems to be kind of no one's got time for it because they're too busy watching Scott Morrison wash someone's hair.
Yeah, we've only got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to do one of those terribly contrived endings to a webinar, which, you always have to look forward and ask the optimistic question, all that stuff. We've got to end like that. But perhaps we could frame it around the News Media Bargaining Code. Is that enough? Is that going to do enough to help the industry get a more positive or optimistic outlook? Matthew, do you have a view on that?
Yes, I do. I'll throw the. This is from Hal Crawford originally, who used to work with 9MSN and is now a sort of industry consultant. But his view is no, it won't be. Most of the deals that have been done are for 3 years, and he thinks that Google and Facebook will really tighten the screws in 3 years' time. So there's a kind of window right now where a lot of money, some estimates 200 million, some estimates up to 300 million, have flowed into the industry, but his main point is that there's a potentially very sharp window to that. And so what do we do then, sort of, is his question.
Yeah, and it's coming up for review. Do you have a view, Emma, on whether the News Media Bargaining Code is going to be the right injection? It's
not, because it's not going to fund people like Michael and other, innovative media operators. It's not the answer. I think foundations, increasingly, especially in a wealthy country like Australia, the more foundations give money to, family foundations and so on, can provide some injections and do it in a way that, like the New York Times, where it's a bunch of well-meaning individuals that have arm's length relationship with the editorial side, but certainly not the platforms themselves. I don't think that's the answer.
Michael, you've only got about a minute or so, but what's your view on that?
I've got a slightly more controversial view. I think it's a complete fraud and it's a mate steal for the big media companies who are getting most of that 200 or 300 million. There's not even an arbitration in place. Basically, Google's sort of dragged into it. It's based on the premise, as News Corp kept on whining and Nine kept on whining about, they're stealing our content. They're stealing our content. They're not stealing the content. They're providing a link to your paywall. They're doing you a favour for free. It's a free service. It's just that these guys are on the wrong side of history, the major media. Search is where all the money is, with one gigantic global monopoly. It does nothing to address surveillance. It does nothing to address the fact that Google, with a little tweak of its algorithm, could overthrow a government. Does nothing to address any of the problems. It's just a bit of money for the government's mates that is being cajoled and forced out of Google and Facebook. And it props up old, inefficient industries that should be left to die because look at the toxic influence of these companies and their failure to hold politicians and corporations to account. I think it's an absolute disgrace, and I can't believe that everybody in Parliament voted for it, and almost the entire mainstream. Of course, they're conflicted. The old Mandy Rice Davies, they would say that, wouldn't they? It's I think it's bizarre. And there's no arbitration, so it doesn't actually functionally work. There's nothing legally enforceable about it at the moment.
Well, I'm so glad that we didn't get that contrived optimistic ending. It's completely unrealistic to watch it anyway. Look, the research for the Upheaval book that Kathy referred to at the beginning of the talk, this is the book co-edited by Matthew and I. That came out of the work that we did in the New Beats Australian Research Council research project with colleagues from several universities, some of whom are tuned in today. So thank you for joining us. Can I say thank you to Emma Alberici, thank you very much to Michael West for joining us, and thank you, Matthew, for joining the panel. That's all from this webinar from Melbourne Press Club. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.